Absolutely.
Do they not?
Oh, thanks.
Should we spread around?
Yeah, let's have one of you. Yeah, I would say take a seat on the end. Maybe one of you on one end and one of you on the other. If you want. She's over there. So yeah, I think one on each side would be good. Thank you so much.
Should we leave one up here?
Yeah, let's leave one up here. Thanks.
Hi, good evening. Welcome to the new and always evolving MoMA, and we're delighted to have you all here this evening. My name is Paula Crown. I'm chair of the MoMA Education Committee. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees, an artist, and an art education advocate. Tonight we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the Education Department with a provocative query with respect to art education. What should we fight for? So many of us demur when asked if we're creative. Truth is, we all are. We express our uniqueness in the way we move, communicate, make marks through our writing, dancing, singing, or drawing. Art is a language through which we communicate and connect with others. It's a way to manifest ideas and emotions. It expands our understanding of our own selves and in the space which we all cohabitate. In one important way, art education provides enhanced tools of communication. And I expect we would all agree that that's a good thing these days, is to have more communication arrows in our quiver. From its inception, MoMA has been bold in its critical thinking and its experimental approach to art education. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller started this museum with a bold vision and an educational charter. Tonight's another example of MoMA's expansive approach in addressing evolving times and the needs of our community. We are committed to convening people in respectful conversation about the creative process. It starts with listening. As my children remind me, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. It starts with listening and observing with all of our senses a tiptoe. Our new museum offers experimental spaces for engaging in art processes, like the new Creativity Lab and the Art Lab. Through building networks of partners in all 5 city boroughs, and with technologies to expand connections among individuals and learning communities across the globe. With our Coursera platform, we have engaged 700,000 participants. We will be live streaming tonight, and we'll be in the Twitterverse, so tonight's conversation will be broadcast across the world. Our ecosystem continues to broaden and expand in significant ways. We are so appreciative to have your engagement and your participation. We value the importance of art in our daily lives. I expect that each of us had access to art education in one way or another. We believe in the power of art and feel the urgency to provide art education in these divisive times. Tonight's a night of many voices and perspectives. I'm looking forward to learning from our speakers and hear from you, the audience. It's a pleasure to introduce Glenn Lowry, the Rockefeller Director of the Museum of Modern Art, to hear how art education played a significant role in his life.
Thank you, Paula, first for that introduction, but most importantly for your inspired leadership as the chair of our Education Committee. I'm delighted to be here to both recognize and champion the importance of art education at the Museum of Modern Art. As Paula mentioned, it is actually embedded in our charter. We were not chartered as an art museum by the Regents of New York, but as an educational institution, something that we have taken very seriously from our inception in 1929. In fact, Alfred Barr, the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art, was deeply inspired by what he saw at the Bauhaus, that radical and innovative art school that he encountered on his early trips to Germany in the late 1920s. And when he imagined the Museum of Modern Art, he imagined it as a laboratory to whose experiments the public would be invited. And in so doing, he was, as far as I can tell, the first museum director, certainly in the United States and possibly in the world, to have made this conjunction between art and people. Because until then, the Enlightenment understanding of the Museum of Modern Art, or everything's about the Museum of Modern Art. The Enlightenment understanding of the museum was as an instrument of knowledge, that is, a place that would be a repository of the artifacts of the past, and thus provide a record for history into the future. Barr understood that we were about something else, about an experiment, about radical new art, and that in order to make that experiment work, it required a public, people. And so education became the lubricant as well as a catalyst between people and art. And so it is absolutely in the DNA of this institution to think hard about the different ways in which learning can amplify our experiences. My own history is perhaps a reflection on the power of serendipity. I thought that I would be an Olympic skier as a teenager, an aspiration that was dashed relatively quickly when I was racing in Europe and realized there were many, many, many better racers than I. So when I went off to college, although I did get in on a ski scholarship because I doubt I would have gotten in on my academic prowess, I went off to college determined to be a medical doctor, in part because my father's best friend was a medical doctor and he was somebody I looked up to and admired, but also because the only subject I hadn't failed out of in high school was biology, so it seemed like an appropriate direction to pursue. And what did me in early on was the conjunction of primate biology at 8:30 in the morning. It was just too brutal to watch those gorillas go at it early, and the recognition, I kid you not, and the recognition that every other student that I could see in my freshman dorm was determined to be a medical doctor, and they all looked just like me. And it was actually horrifying to think that I was just part of this massive stream of young men and women seeking to do the same thing. So I went to my college advisor and had the probably prototypical freshman meltdown and said, this is a disaster. I don't know what to do. And I was in tears. And he said, you're at a liberal arts college. The whole point of being here is to discover what you don't know. So why don't you make a list of subjects you know nothing about and take courses in them? This had never occurred to me. And you have to understand this is pre-computers in the digital age. So I went to the course catalog and I leafed my way through it, and I realized I knew nothing about philosophy, check, religion, check, art history, check. So I had 3 subjects that I knew absolutely nothing about. And then I had to go back through the same course catalog and try and find courses that met on Tuesdays and Thursdays, because my girlfriend, now partner in life, was a senior at college, and it was very clear it was going to be more fun living with her at Bryn Mawr than being a freshman at Williams. So that meant really long weekends, but it also meant courses that met in the afternoon, because I didn't like to wake up early. So you go back through that filter without a computer and try and figure out what courses in philosophy, religion, and art history met on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the afternoon. And lo and behold, there was one in Islamic and Indian art. Met all the criteria, 4 o'clock, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and I knew nothing about Islam, India, or art. I was in. So first day, second semester of my freshman year, post-meltdown, I walked in, and there on the screen, first slide, a painting from an illustrated manuscript of the early 16th century of the court of the Gayumar, the legendary Persian king. Course was taught by Milo Beach, a charismatic teacher, and I was hooked. Like a flash, I knew I'd found a subject that could occupy my interest and attention for a lifetime. And so I went very quickly from anxiety to absolute conviction. I didn't need to take those religion courses or philosophy courses, just give me more art history. And I became an absolute art history fiend, taking as many courses as I could in as many different subjects in art history as I could, until I graduated and then didn't know what to do. And one of my professors, not Milo, but somebody else said, you ought to get a graduate degree in art history, something that had not occurred to me. And I then pursued that. And I realized that had I not had that meltdown, had I not had a desire to organize my life around long weekends, I would never in a million years have taken a course in Islamic or Indian art. It would have been just absolutely impossible to do. It would have been out of my frame of reference. And my takeaway from that is the power of serendipity to change our lives, and the ability of art to connect across time. That an artist working in Safavid Iran in the early 16th century could make a work of art that I could respond to 400 plus years later just struck me as absolutely extraordinary. And I'll end this little story by saying there's nothing new under the sun. Many years later, 30 years later, I was asked to remember my earliest childhood memory for a book that somebody was writing. And I sat down and I thought about it, and I realized the earliest memory that was vivid in my mind that wasn't the result of stories my parents had told me, so you think you remember them, but was actually I could visualize it, was when my parents moved to Williamstown. I was 6 years old. My mother thought she should take me to the Clark Art Institute, a recently built museum just off the campus of Williams that is basically impressionist and post-impressionist paintings. And we went, and I got lost and separated from my parents, which was fine because I was bored out of my mind. And I found myself sitting in front of an extraordinary Bouguereau, a nymph and satyr, cavorting in the woods. And I realized there at 6 years old, I was already looking at paintings. This is the power of art. I'm excited to hear from our speakers tonight about why art education is so critically vital and important to the way we live, to the way we think, to the lives we lead. And now, let me turn this over to our absolutely extraordinary Wendy Woon, the Edward and John Noble Foundation Deputy Director for Education, to introduce tonight's agenda. Wendy.
I'm a walker and a talker, so not a podium talker. So I just wanted to thank Paula and thank Glenn for your support always. And also to thank the Trustee Committee on Education, who are amazing supporters. And I just wanted to mention that 3 of our speakers tonight, I'm very excited and thankful to them as well, are from the Trustee Committee on Education. I also want to thank our participants from MoMA programs. So there will be some speakers from the audience. If I haven't spoken to you, you don't need to worry right now. And I also want to thank our great sponsors, the Niarchos Foundation, Bloomberg, and Volkswagen, who are really supportive of the education department here. So this is an experiment, and this is kind of how we roll in education. We like to try things that make us a little nervous, but I feel like the room is full of so much great energy, and also online, there's this whole group of people who are also listening in right now. And one thing I wanted to tell you about was, like, you're probably wondering, how did this all, what's the context for this? How did you come to this? Well, for our 80th anniversary, we hired Sarah Torres as an education research assistant to go through our archives and really start to understand this. And she found this book called I Believe. It's what 31 art teachers in 1943 thought about what the value of art was in society. And so we started to think about this, and actually we found that MoMA was a huge convener of annual conferences. Before there was the National Art Education Association or AAM or anything like that, MoMA was the place from 1943 to 1965 where annual conversations about the meaning of art in life with big thinkers and talkers, and also some practical, exchange on techniques in art education. And so that kind of prompted us to do that. So we thought, Sarah actually started tweeting art education as a radical act and asking people this summer, and it was very sticky. So we found that actually people are doing it more and more, and we're getting some substantive comments. Can you imagine? Substantive comments on Twitter. It's kind of a new thing. And so one thing we wanted you to notice, you have in your packet a little manifesto making kit. And that's for you, and I hope that you will think while the speakers are speaking about your thoughts about why art education and what it should fight for. And so there's a little chair, and the chair is to remind us of the collective possibilities of education, but also formal education, which is often straight lines of chairs in a row. Tonight, I want to introduce our 5 main speakers. They'll speak for 7 minutes each. Willis Thomas, artist. Carol Becker, Dean at Columbia School for the Arts. Kate Fowle, new director of MoMA PS1. Félix Matos Rodríguez, who is the chancellor of Cuny, actually also the new chancellor, or recently new chancellor. And Anna Deavere Smith, actor, playwright, amazing woman. So I am going to introduce Hank first, and take it away, Hank.
Thank you so much all for coming out. Thank you, Wendy, for making this a possibility. Thank you, Paula and Glenn, for your stewardship. Of course, I'm like, okay, I had these slides, but I started writing stuff, and so I'm like, where do I start? But I believe that all art is political, and I believe that is a fact because, as Glenn pointed out, everything that this museum is collecting will outlive all of us. And basically, there is no culture without art. And culture is what human civilizations are founded on. And therefore, there is no humanity without art. And for that reason, I think that all artists should be seen as civic leaders. And museums should take it as a serious responsibility to see themselves as civic space, not only in furthering conversation, but opening opportunities for political and social growth. Do you know that there are more people that go to museums and libraries across the country than go to sporting events every year? And the difference is people go to sporting events to actually zone out and focus in on the rules, and people go to museums and libraries to have their minds opened and challenged. What was I going to say? Oh, okay, yeah. Speaking of artists, Paul Robeson, incredible, groundbreaking American artist, said that artists are the gatekeepers of truth, that we are civilization's radical voice. And thinking about that quote, if artists are the gatekeepers of truth, then are museums the gardens of truth? How should we think about the ideas that are planted in these museums and how they should grow and how they grow? And Alfred Barr said that historical museum has to be very conservative and careful in its choices. The modern museum, on the other hand, has to be audacious, take chances. It has to consider the probability that it would be wrong in a many good cases, in a good many cases, and take the consequences later. I think it's critical for us to acknowledge that in spaces like this, we can, will, and should be wrong, and that's a critical part of growth. I also think a part of growth for my own self was seeds planted in a young woman here. That's my mom. And I like to always point out the incredible impact of art, not only what you see, but also what you don't see. My mother, a young woman who loved books, loved magazines, and loved photographs, didn't see enough stories of people that looked like the people she knew in her family and in her life. And when she was in college studying photo history, there were no stories about Black photographers, and so she was assigned an independent study project, and she said, I found no standard art history that refers to any African-American artists. References led me to more references, which were scanty. I've written 50 letters to possible resources, and I've had this enthusiastic feedback. Mind you, at this time, photography was barely being considered art. Along the way, she actually, I found this, and this is incredible, because I never knew where I lived. Now we have Google. When I was born, I Googled that today. I was like, oh, that's where I was born. But to think about her preserving to this day her MoMA education card, 40 years, she would not like me to say that, says the power of what art education can mean to a certain person. And I grew up in kind of her studies, and those studies resulted 13 years later into her first book, Black Photographers, 1840 to 1940, a biobibliography, thinking about what it meant that African Americans were making photographs in 1840, 25 years before the end of slavery in the United States, when it was illegal for African Americans to be able to read. How do we think about what that meant? And that book led to another book, and that led to another book, and another book, and another, 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 and she just continues to go. And what she's recognized is that our histories are created in our mind and through the spaces that are open through the lenses in the camera. That who's being pictured is important, but who's taking the picture is also sometimes even more important. Looking at images like these historically by Louis Agassiz, who are in these contested photographs now in the collection of Harvard University, and artists like Carrie Mae Weems, who revisited them through her art practice and said, you became a scientific profile, an anthropological debate, a Negroid type, a photographic subject. and then turning the lens on herself, saying, "I looked and looked to see what so terrified you." This contrasting of the status quo through taking agency and also looking back at other people from different generations who we presume were disempowered, but also had found agency in their own forms of representation, African American women, and the most photographed American or photographed man of the 19th century being Frederick Douglass, who recognized that through his confrontation of the lens, he could challenge all the stereotypes that were created to dehumanize him at his birth. And then other photographers like Gordon Parks, the first African American to direct a major Hollywood studio film, I have a show up at the foundation today, but was also an incredible photographer that works Progress Administration, but also Life Magazine. At FDR's Works Progress Administration, he took this picture of Ella Watson, who was working at and living in squalor while cleaning the Capitol, and recreated American Gothic. Looking at that time, 1943, thinking about the role of art in civic life, I looked at the illustrations of Norman Rockwell, who I've always been fascinated with, but how his art was kind of used to rally literally the troops and the country into one of the most ambitious, audacious, and maybe honorable struggles in our society. My friends and I decided he turned Rockwell's FDR said everyone was entitled to 4 basic freedoms: freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of worship, and freedom of speech. And my friends and I decided that we should revisit Rockwell's 4 freedoms in the 21st century, and what would that look like? And so we started a super PAC initially called 4 Freedoms, FOR Freedoms, and we decided that we wanted to cover public space with critical thinking that's founded in fine art thinking. So we did billboards, exhibitions. We were in residence at MoMA PS1, and we learned that a lot of the way that modern art got across the world was through proselytizing and sending exhibitions across the world. So we did this 50-state initiative where we did these exhibitions, town halls, lawn signs, collaborated with hundreds of artists across the country to do projects trying to say that we as artists are the storytellers of our society and have a role in shaping and creating the narratives that these non-creative people who often write our laws are kind of, because art, I'm saying so much, I'm sorry, I'm trying to rush through it. Art creates the culture that the laws are designed by. This is actually a billboard by our Paula Crown here, Hurt People, that was up in Los Angeles. And we were able to work with over 200 artists across the country to do these different billboards, Rasheed Johnson. But I also wanted to end with a story that's resonant in my family, my grandparents, who were part of in a generation that opened the doors for people like me to be standing here. And the faith that my grandmother instilled in me through her work. I revisited this photograph by Ernest Withers, and I always like to read the last line as a poem, which could be my manifesto, where it says, I'm the man, who's the man, you the man, what a man, I am human, I am many, I am amen. Because the greatest gift that any of us is given is our consciousness. So thank you all.
Maybe even longer. So what I think that we should fight for is our children. I think that we should fight for access for those who are marginalized. I think that in my career as an art educator and now a principal, I have seen how art can change lives, how it can change the trajectory of someone's life. And so through the arts, our children can heal, they can learn, they can connect. We can attend to their social and emotional health. We can connect with their cultural being, their needs. We can make them aware of others. We can make them self-aware. And ultimately, like we heard this so far, we are changing humanity when we give access to our children. And so I believe that we should fight for our children and fight for their access to the arts.
I'm pleased to introduce Carol Becker.
It's great to be here. There are a lot of friends in the audience, so hi, everybody. So I've written we get each 7 minutes. Wendy didn't mention that, but we get 7 minutes, so. Okay, here we go. I've spent most of my adult life building, administrating, writing about, teaching in, and fighting for art schools and artists. And this passion began in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, where I was raised in a very wonderful family, but one that was neither educated nor interested in art. But fortunately, we lived in close proximity to the Brooklyn Museum, which was then the hub of all art activity in the borough. Not true anymore. My friends and I spent so much time in that museum that it felt as if it belonged to us. This experience gave me a lifelong sense that I had a right to access the arts in all their dimensionality and in multiple contexts. In those early days of roaming the galleries and even drawing the mummies installed in darkly lit rooms, I understood so little about art and art making that had someone asked me, or my friends, who created those amazing objects, we might have said God. We didn't know artists, nor how art was made, nor how these objects had traveled across oceans and continents. So I probably was destined to serve as a dean of 2 major art schools, learning about the process of art making, the worlds that surround it, and the increasingly urgent need for such institutions that cultivate the imagination. And as a result of the entitlement these early experiences gave to me, I had enough confidence to repeatedly tell the trustees of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I worked for many years as the dean, most of whom were deeply enamored with the objects in that astounding collection, that they unequivocally also had to support artists, because without artists, there simply is no art. Art schools are the places where the next generation of artists and art educators are educated. In their contemporary iteration, these schools are inherently subversive. They create a holding environment where play, failure, risk-taking, interdisciplinarity, and access to dreams and the unconscious are central to the pedagogy. Populated by students and taught by artist educators, they are about the making of things, haptic and digital, and about finding the ideal forms for ideas and new knowledge. They should be understood as some of the most radically inspiring educational institutions in the world, yet in a utilitarian society, such as ours, that seeks to quantify, categorize, and monetize most everything, they are often very undervalued. At the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, comprised of a school and a museum, experimental art making, at times messy and sometimes even wild, had to compete with the irrefutable worth of the collection. But at a major university such as Columbia, where I am now, the challenge for an art school is very different. With 16 professional schools, such as law, medicine, engineering, public health, and so forth, an art school has to demonstrate how it is essential to the university's mission, or even daringly able to inspire that mission or to lead that mission, which is to educate and create new knowledge and then to transform the world. So to this end, I recently conceived the Year of Water. It was an initiative to highlight the urgency of water issues as they relate to climate change and the daily lives of millions globally. It might seem presumptuous for an art school dean to attempt to make this issue visible when so many Columbia climate scientists and institutes are already focused on water. But in fact, it took the arts to convene all those entities and to make sure that water stress, a reality for more than 1/4 of the world's population, was understood as central to the university's concerns. By inviting my colleagues to participate instead of waiting to be invited, the arts helped to develop an unprecedented prototype for collaboration across university disciplines. And because the arts know how to cultivate the heart as well as the mind, and to both dazzle and inform, we wanted a very spectacular event at the end to energize the public sphere. So in October, we brought Dutch artist Dan Roosgaard to install a piece called Waterlicht on the Manhattanville campus. And we invited our neighbors in Harlem and students and faculty and others in the city to experience this installation that uses laser light and mist to immerse the collective in a glorious but rather alarming sea of blue light, simulating water rising. 17,000 people registered to come. 10,000 came and dreamt together for 3 nights. So you ask what I would fight for. First, I would fight for this planet, because without it, humans and other species will have no home. And essential to this fight is the imagination, the most important human asset at this time, and maybe at all times, because without imagination, we could never envision what does not as yet exist, or ever begin to solve the complex problems that arise daily. Artists and the spaces where art is produced know how to cultivate the imagination and to dream a saner, safer world into being. So I'm going to show you 1 minute now of the image of Waterlicht, and you can see how people got immersed in a really complex idea through art. So will you turn on the video, who's ever...
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Ria Panjwara. Ria has been involved in teen programs for many years and now is graduated onto college.
Hello, my name is Ria Panjwani, and I'm a former MoMA Teens participant. I'm now a second-year student at the Fashion Institute of Technology, studying communication and graphic design. Since 2016, MoMA has given me a safe space for my artistic exploration. From In the Making to Digital Advisory Board, MoMA has given me a powerful and inspiring arts education. I fight for arts education because every child deserves a space for their creativity to thrive and grow. Arts education taught me how to think and how to see. It gave me a new perspective about the world and allowed me to create something beautifully unconventional. Without arts education and without MoMA, I never would have achieved my full potential. MoMA has given me a community of thinkers and has connected me to so many unique people who share the same interests as me. MoMA's teen art programs changed my life for the better and allowed me to find myself as a professional in the art world. Thank you.
Wonderful. Gives me great pleasure to introduce Kate Fowle.
Hello, it's great to be here tonight. This is my first public speaking gig as the director of MoMA PS1, and it's a pleasure to be talking about education as that first experience. So I think similarly to there's a pattern going on through these presentations today. Because I also wanted to say that I think that it's artists that have to be at the centre of everything we're talking about. And I'm speaking particularly from the perspective of being somebody who's been involved in art institutions for the whole of my career. And I think, as I say here, it's important that institutions actually introduce audiences to artists and their perspectives on the world. Because when you think about it, it might sound a bit simple, but it's the key thing that art institutions have that are different to any other type of institution. It's the artists and the way that they see the world that is important. And through that, it's important that institutions make people feel that they have the agency to ask questions and access to knowledge and a platform for debate. This goes back to the whole thing that Glenn was actually talking about with Alfred Barr. The questions, however, are whose histories and whose perspectives and whose art worlds. Because, of course, there are many, many different versions of this, and it's something that I think we need to really kind of think out from, you know, the agency and the access. It's like, of what? And who's to say what it is that gives people the confidence to be able to actually participate in conversations? So for the last 25 years, I've been working in a number of different contexts and different places, thinking through these questions with a lot of people, and starting or being involved in starting a number of different cultural institutions, one of which was the Ullens Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, where I was the international curator for a number of years. Another is Independent Curators International in New York, where it's a 35-year-old small non-profit, but in the last 10 years, we have worked with more than 450 curators from over 70 different countries in it's around about 35 different countries, talking to curators about how to actually think through what art means there and how to initiate institutions of all different scales to be able to present the ideas of artists. And then most recently I've been at Garage Museum of Contemporary Art and setting up the programming there through the public education, through the public programs, through the exhibitions, research. And it's interesting because there it was the first time that I started using the terminology that Garage was a publicly minded, privately funded organization. And it's thinking, this other word I think that is kind of something that we need to think harder about is the term public. Because we take for granted what that means, to be publicly minded or to be looking at various publics, because there are many, many places where the word public and state don't necessarily mean the same thing. And access to publicly minded places isn't necessarily straightforward. And it's within that kind of framework that I think it's important to think about the context of where these institutions are. And this is when we start to understand how artists and their perspectives can change things. But there are three, I think, different points that help us understand what a context is. And the first one is time. And often with time, we're talking about missing histories. When you're in time, the time that you're in, there are many histories and many perspectives that have been missing from the stories. The perspectives is, of course, always the local and the global at the same time. We no longer live in one type of place where you have one perspective. And the place, of course, is not just the geography, but also the politics. And so in my experience, I've been looking and working and thinking with artists that often have not had the opportunity to have the history books before them or to be part of the history books. When you're working and living in places where contemporary art was not something that was public because it was underground, it was illegal, you could be arrested for doing it, the history books just weren't being written. There was another type of art that was being talked about. And so often, like both in China and in Russia, the conversations that were happening were done either temporarily, through performance, temporary gatherings, through conversations, through smaller scale dialogues that were happening. But of course, they were just as rich as they would have been if you had a museum to put them in. It's just that there weren't any that would accept that. So in beginning to work at the Ullens Center, one of the very straightforward things was to think about what a contemporary museum was, not necessarily a museum of contemporary art, but what is a contemporary museum? When you're used to going to see places, if you were even interested at all, where it was the 19th century version of museums. Again, what Glenn was talking about with the whole way of kind of recording history. And so the Ullens, a lot of it was about just having a different feel, feeling like art was exciting and showing Chinese contemporary art in that way. And you'll see at the end of the this big tunnel, you came into this exhibition through there. So like how you experience entering into an exhibition, where art making and education takes place, kind of in the middle of the entrance, so that it wasn't tucked away, so you could feel immediately that you were involved in something that was kind of being made right there. And of course, this is all new audiences. New audiences because of the fact that it was the first institution that was presenting contemporary art in China, in Beijing. And there was art being made in the space by major contemporary, like Chinese contemporary artists that hadn't actually had the opportunity to show in China before, but were known all over the world by that time. In Russia, there was a similar situation insofar as Garage was the first institution to think about what it was to be a contemporary museum. And transparency and accessibility was one of the key things that we started playing with immediately, where you kind of walked into art and you could be immersed in art. Art became a way that you could kind of inhabit the space. Within the midst of art, you found yourself in the museum. You could participate, you could surprise yourself, you could test out different ideas. We could talk about what a contemporary museum was out loud by doing conferences saying what is a contemporary museum, bringing international speakers and local speakers. We could talk about performance or different art forms, bringing international people to talk about something that also had a history there that nobody had really thought about. Building the archive and the library so that the histories and the knowledge of what had actually been happening that hadn't been written could be brought to the table and then presented through books, through exhibitions, and people could participate in saying what those histories actually were. Doing research into the perspectives that artists had on the world, cultural phenomena that they were interested in, and giving them the opportunities to do the research in Russia in archives that otherwise they couldn't access. Through the staff, the training, because of course nobody had the training because there were no institutions there before, to actually kind of experience what it was to be one of these contemporary museums. And so all of this is what I bring to MoMA PS1, and thinking about this context, which is an incredible situation to be in, because of course PS1 has over 40 years of the beginning of the experimental space movement, and then an ongoing organic relationship with a constant kind of shifting and changing in relation to MoMA and a conversation there. And I love the fact that with MoMA PS1, there is this second skin. Artists are embedded in this place. Artists are literally, like, everywhere you go, you can feel that artists have been there for a while. And through things like Sunday sessions, there are a number of conversations where artists are talking to each other and talking to publics about what matters to them the most. They're smaller, more kind of intimate conversations a lot of the time. But it's artists that are bringing these conversations to the table and deciding. And then in 2013, there was a moment that I think is extremely interesting with dealing, similar to what Carol was talking about, dealing with climate and dealing with all the issues that were happening right here with Hurricane Sandy. PS1 going to the Rockaways, questioning what the actual place, the environment that we're living in. And of course, we've worked with MoMA numerous times, and since I've started, I've been inviting MoMA to come and work as much as possible in PS1 and to bring different programs there. So just to finish, there's a project that's coming up in the spring that I just wanted to leave you with, where we're going on to another stage of thinking about what could actually be the potential for somewhere like PS1 to bring artists and their perspectives together with this idea of agency. And it's an exhibition called Marking Time, which is developed by Dr. Nicole R. Fleetwood. And it's presenting 25 artists, some of which are currently incarcerated in US prisons and some of them who are unincarcerated. And together they are presenting work that basically question state repression, erasure, and imprisonment. And we're starting to put together a thought collective of artists who are the ones that are determining what the kind of public programming should be around this and how it should develop. So what we're beginning to do is think through with Jesse Crimes and Russell Craig, who are two formerly incarcerated artists, the idea of a school that would be within PS1, which of course is a school in itself, that would be providing the facilities and the space for those artists to think out loud together about what kind of education they might need to be able to move forward. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I'm looking for Mustafa Yassar, who's up here, who is a CUNY, one of our, in the pilot CUNY ambassador program. So.
I think if the art education system will be redesigned from scratch, and ask me what do you want from art education as a student, the only thing that I would request will be freedom. Just freedom. We should definitely fight for freedom. And I believe the rest is just child play, honestly. I graduated from Queen's College, and I like two things the most about my college. The first thing was our professors, they never considered us as empty containers that should be filled with information. The second thing was they never considered themselves as an absolute source of information or the knowledge. They listened to us, they loved us, they encouraged us, and then we do the rest. This was the most beautiful thing that I learned from Queen's College. And when we think of the information, I think information is not that much important. It is important if you personalize it, if you integrate this information that you received from your professors or college. So for many years, I will come to MoMA to personalize this information. The image that you see on the screen on the right, this is my verb list, and it shows my interactions at the MoMA. So I just created each verb for specific time, specific moment. So it is very meaningful to me because when I look at this image, I see my memories, I see sculptures, I see paintings and drawings. All of it, my history is here. So I think we should definitely fight for freedom and let people do, let people experience, let people personalize the information in a, yeah, this is the thing I will definitely ask for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. And what great segue to the Chancellor of CUNY, Félix Matos Rodríguez.
I think it should be Mustafa who's out, in front here talking. So very, very proud, and thank you, Greg and Wendy, for this invitation. As Carol said, we were given 7 minutes. I go back to the times when I was in the faculty teaching Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Tuesdays, students like you. And the teaching evaluation says, speaks too fast, moves around the room, and has an accent. So I am going to try to stand still and stick to my 7 minutes. I by now, you see that I'm the guy wearing a tie, having the institutional pin, so I'm not an artist, I'm not a creative mind, I am not some of the real phenomenal fellow speakers that you've had. I guess my role here is to talk about more about the institutional part of the mission. And in MoMA, cultural institutions like MoMA have a vital public mission, which is similar to our mission in the City University of New York. At the core, we are places that seek to provoke thought and to inspire the imagination. And a little bit of context on the CUNY side, we are perhaps the most extraordinary racial and ethnic socioeconomic diversity of any educational institution in the nation. 70% of our undergraduates are students of color. More than 1/3 were born outside the United States. 40% comes from households in New York earning less than $20,000 in household income a year. And 61% are the first ones in their families to graduate from college. And with this very diverse profile, there is not one single institution in the U.S. who does a better job of moving people who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds into the middle and professional class. And we do this through access and academic excellence, and we have a number of our outstanding faculty here in the audience. And again, nobody does a better job, nobody does social mobility better. And we are radically proud of this because we know how important social mobility is for our democracy, for our freedom, and for our country. I had the opportunity this year to join the students from one of our 25 campuses, the Macauley Honor School, which is sort of an honors program that draws on very talented students coming from all the CUNY campuses. And for one night, the entire new class gets to enjoy the Brooklyn Museum of Art for them. The museum is closed to everybody else, and it's just open for them. And they have some group projects to do, and they get to roam the entire, all the galleries are open to them for that night. There's some projects that they have to do. It's an exercise in ice breaking for them to get to know. But what an incredibly powerful experience to be able to go with these students as they were walking, looking at the mummies, your mummies there at the museum, all the different spaces, in groups initially, talking about what they saw. But what I loved was this group of mostly immigrant, first-generation college students of color owning the museum and feeling the museum was theirs, right? I came back home that night so energized, so moved. Personally for me too, I mean, after a while, the novelty of having the chance sort of wore off, and I was able to actually join them and then walk around the museum too. And there's a couple of paintings there by a Puerto Rican painter, Francisco Oller, sort of one of the better known 19th century Latin American painters that I have used in my own academic work. I'm a historian, a 19th century specialist in the Caribbean. And I have seen an exhibit there before talking about that personal connection with art of Oller's painting. And I have used some of his work in some of my writing, but I remember that exhibit being a transformational one for me intellectually in terms of reimagining the familiar, right? Which is one of the wonderful things that art does. Something that I thought, I mean, when you go to graduate school, you become an expert in a couple of things. And going to that exhibit, I remember coming back and rethinking a lot of the things that I've written about, rethinking the way that I was going to teach my classes. And I was able at that night at Brooklyn to reconnect, and actually it was lovely to be alone. I mean, normally, when you go to some of these shows, you have to elbow people and tackle for position to be able to see things, particularly it's very popular. It was just so magical to be there one-on-one with the art. I tell you that story about the Macaulay students, right? And those are some of the best students in the city of New York academically, because 1/3 of that entering class had never been to a museum, right? Which is part of why we wanted to take the class there. And that's something that our faculty do in all our 25 campuses. But 1/3 of that really great group of students had never been to a museum. And that is something that has to change. And we're talking about things that we dream of, the things that we want to change. Those are things that we want to change. And we have a program that has had a partnership with MoMA called CUNY Arts that is moving in that direction. And that CUNY Arts program has sort of three key parts. One is the belief that great cultural institutions in our city have opened their doors and they're offering free admission to our students. One of those partnerships is here with MoMA, a great example of how two important educational institutions can partner together. And I so much enjoy when I come to see shows here and I'm on the line waiting to do my thing and contribute to see students with the CUNY ID coming in for free. A second part of CUNY Arts, because many of our students are working and they cannot take unpaid internships, right? Which is something that it's important. Through the CUNY Cultural Course, which is a program that we began several years ago, we're able to provide paid internships opportunities for hundreds of CUNY students so they work in all over cultural institutions in New York City. So they get paid, which is important considering where our students are coming from. They get the experience and they help to hopefully provide a better pipeline in terms of having our cultural institutions in the city be more reflective of the individuals that live in the city, and they get professional networks and all the things that we know are vitally important for individuals who might be thinking about careers in the arts or in arts management in administration, right? Mustafa is one of our cultural ambassadors, which is part of that program that has benefited hundreds of students, right? And then the third component of CUNY Arts is working to integrate the arts into all aspects of the university curriculum. Through that program, our faculty are encouraged to work with cultural institutions, and there's some support for joint work between the many cultural institutions in the city and our faculty in our campus, and we hope that creates energy and encourages the talent in our campuses. So for me, this is one of the things to fight for is that continuation of access, that continuation of the lifelong educational learning. Maybe some of the students, that third that I mentioned to there, maybe they didn't benefit through any arts education, and this is the opportunity to get inspired, to want to do that, to discover that in our campuses, to discover the great power of art. And on that note, I want to thank our friends in MoMA for being such incredible partners, and looking forward to doing more. So thank you.
Thank you. I have the pleasure of introducing Luz Cantres. Luz was a participant in our Access programs for many years, and actually has been giving back to MoMA because she actually did an Access video for training, and over 700 people were trained at MoMA and our frontline staff before we reopened on Access and Equity, and you were absolutely a star, Luz. So I'm turning it over to you. What would you fight for?
Thank you. So I'm a current participant of Creatabilities, and I've been attending for about the last 6 to 7 years. But before attending Creatabilities, I used to run a support group for people with various disabilities. And what we found in the support group, along with myself, is that a lot of participants felt very isolated and didn't get out much, didn't participate in anything. And so I spoke with people that assisted me running the program, and one of the individuals suggested that I attend a creatability session, and I did and loved it. I couldn't stop talking about the program and how it made me feel. I just felt very welcomed and not judged. I felt that I could be myself, and that I could be as creative as possible, and that no one was there to judge me. I brought this information back to the group, and I just couldn't stop talking about it, and the group wanted to participate as well. So I spoke to the educators here and the staff here, and that was made possible by the program here. And the group loved it just as much as I did, so much so that they went back to the group, and they wanted to have something similar, but they didn't know how to go about creating it, or how to continue to participate in a program like Creatabilities, because they had very limited resources in transporting. And so with the group and the people that helped me run it, we were able to put together an art reception for them to have the following year. And so what I would like to advocate for and fight for is more inclusiveness in the workplace, with having not only people with various disabilities, or just people in general, be able to work with all types of individuals and encourage inclusiveness in that aspect. Because of the program being so open and generous to the group in allowing them to attend, they were able to then carry that desire to want to run a reception just like at MoMA.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Luz. Okay. I hope you're all thinking and writing with your little pencils because I'm going to call on you after I call on Anna Deavere Smith, our final speaker.
Well, I've been teaching acting and performance composition for a very, very long time. So I'm going to talk about what I would fight for in an acting classroom. When I teach, applause is not allowed during class. Class is not a show. It's a lab. What should we fight for? I would like to fight for a laboratory where all assembled are committed to reaching beyond accepted ideas of self, even reaching beyond the idea that one's actual self should be completely integrated. I know a weaver who deliberately broke the warp thread while weaving beautiful dresses. As you know, the warp thread is held tight and stationary so that the weft thread can move confidently up and over. Her dresses had several incidents. Is this still working? Yep. Had several incidents of broken warps. They were gorgeous. How can you act if every single thread in the tapestry of you is tightly woven? I'm very interested in the warp threads that make up race, class, sexuality, and gender, because those warps can or cannot create tribes. I'd like to fight for a lab where assumptions would be left at the door, yet I know to get through babyhood and youth and adolescence and school, one needs to trust and hold firmly onto some assumptions. I always tell my students on the first day of class, confidence is overrated, give doubt a try. I try to fight for a lab where I-thou relationships bloom. The philosopher Martin Buber wrote about the contrast between I-thou, where you are in relationship to the full humanity of another, and I-it, where you turn another human being into an it, a non-human. Perhaps survival in a tribal world requires it making. Mind over matter. I don't mind and you don't matter. Because after all, the way that you may threaten to truncate the sheer joy of my humanness and maybe even my life itself means that I can't possibly regard you as fully human. Some of my students are dedicated to fighting only for the cause, la causa, of their own identity and for the cause of their tribes. I understand why this is important. Sometimes I wonder why we're not further along. I, too, have lived through what Johnetta Cole, in quoting a colleague of hers from Spelman, called the 3 W's of the canon: all white, all Western, and womanless. I, too, have had to curtsy to the unrelenting, alienation-making, dignity-ignoring gaze of those who sat and still sit in the thrones of the canon. And so when I sense the rumbling of I am about to erupt as a scream from one of my students, I raise the roof a little bit and I say, bring it. A full 4, maybe 5 decades after the canon's walls began to crumble, many of my students still say that their identities are under attack. Now this is a moment. The underrepresented say their identities are under attack, and the previously assumed heirs to the throne, white straight men, say their identities are under attack. What I wish to fight for is an acting class where all of this matters and none of this matters. Learning to act is to fully imagine that you are someone else, to be able to imagine the predicament and the conditions under which others live, to feel yourself as them, and then to make that evident with fine-tuned physio-linguistic skills and presence. The late Joseph Chaikin, a great avant-garde theater artist, said that presence is the feeling that the person on stage is standing right next to you, no matter where you're sitting in the audience. Chaikin calls presence a deep, libidinal surrender that a performer reserves for his anonymous audience. Surrender. Do we surrender to the preoccupation with our tribal identities? Standing up only for your birth-given identity? And by the way, standing up for the dignity of the blood-stained banner of struggle associated with that birth-given identity? Or do we surrender to dare to reach out of our tribes and towards that which is not us? Anonymity. When students are worried about what people will think, can I say this? Can I say that? Can I talk about you? Is that my place? It means that they have predetermined who the audience is. It makes sense that in a time of increased tribalism, a student actor might actually see psychologically the tribe of self and the tribes of other waiting to judge. Just where do you stand? Are you loyal to the tribe? If you want to talk about acting outside of one's race or sex or sexuality or tribe, the conversation becomes very complicated by discussions of opportunity. Who has opportunity and who does not? And that's a very important part of the conversation, and it sometimes boils down to business, the business of visibility. But today, when I'm talking about what I'd like to fight for, I'm not talking about business. I'm talking about a lab. What I would like to fight for is an acting classroom where daily I would raise the roof higher to accommodate the deafening scream of we are, we being not a small tribal we, but a pack of cultural warriors, wolves howling, signaling, we are here. Here is where we live. Come and join us. You, the stranger, you are welcome here. We embrace you. Come and howl with us. Howl. Howl your struggle and your glory. Howl, howl, howl. I'd like to fight for a lab that is timeout. To just teach people how to reach towards that which is not them. That which is where they do not belong. It's a social experiment. After all, if I were to reach to play Donald Trump, even if I were to fail, and surely I would, there's still a chance that I'd learn a lot about America in the process. Create classrooms where difference is an opera, not a skit. Create opportunities for students to imagine who they could never be, who they would never want to be, and ask them to perform exactly that. That's what I'm fighting for.
Whoa. Amazing. Are you ready? I'm going to ask those who you have listened to come up to the front so that they can hear you. And so I hope you're thinking about what you would fight for. So would you like to come up and take a seat? Yep. Paula, will you join? I'm going to do one thing because an audience is often a funny kind of thing. I would like you to turn to someone next to you that you don't know and introduce yourself. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to actually say what you would fight for and share that with them. Okay, go.
Wendy?
Yep.
Could somebody do something?
Yep.
Hi. How are you? Hi, I'm Alice.
Could you ask them to turn the light down in the front a little bit? Thank you.
Earlier, that was brilliant. All of it. All of it. All of it. Here and it does work.
Yeah, thank you for the invite and for the partnership.
I would fight for the most important job in my life is for all gallery chancellor people to function. I'm an aspiring curator and I screw it over here last weekend. Is that better? Is that better? Thank you. So I would say, as I think about my you know, I just Corey Kelly closed that. I got an honorary job. Yeah.
Okay. 30 seconds. Is everybody warmed up? Who would like to tell us what they would fight for? Would you raise your hand? Okay. Right here. We're waiting for the mic, so everybody, and can you introduce yourself as well?
Good evening. I'm Akosia Barthwell Evans. I'm a member of the Trustee Committee on Education. And first of all, I want to thank you, Wendy, for this really inspirational event, and thank all of you. The theme that I hear in listening to everyone is the importance of inclusiveness and equity and diversity. So the importance of recognizing that our world is a diverse world. We're all different in who we are demographically, ethnically, etc. But if we're really going to make a difference and have an impact, we have to have equity and we have to be inclusive. That's what I would fight for.
Thank you. Okay. Someone else? Another hand? Anywhere? Ah, right there. We want to make sure the people who are live streaming can hear you. Thank you for.
Hi, my name is Bill Liebeskind. I'm an art teacher right here in New York City. And it's not a matter of what I would fight for, because I do fight for it every day. And I think one of the things, and there are lots of things that we do, is we teach kids, and I teach high school, to believe in themselves, that their ideas matter, and we want to hear them, and that they need to believe in themselves. And that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. Another hand at the back there. Right at the very back. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sasha Chupchavadze. I wanted to put a word in for something that's a little old-fashioned, but it's hands-on art making. I had the great good fortune having, in conversations with Wendy Woon, of learning about Victor D'Amico and his visionary practices. And I think a really central element to his practices was hands-on art making as a bridge between people's lives, children and adults, and artwork in museums. He would take people on experiential walks where they would connect to their homes and their houses and their neighborhoods. He would then bring them back into the classroom and make hands-on artwork with them as a means of understanding what the contemporary art was in the museum. And I think it's crucially important.
Thank you, Sasha. Okay, who else is brave? Right here, please. Down here. Yep.
To applaud. Okay, I'm very nervous having a microphone. What was that? Very nervous having a microphone. I usually just shout. So I'm Karen Shelby. I'm an art history professor at Baruch College. I've been very happy to be involved with Cuny Arts. Thank you all for that. And what I would fight for is the integration of arts and art history in all disciplines, because what I've been thinking about for a very long time as a person within Cuny who has to teach the survey art history courses, to people who I consider and call my reluctant learners, because they all want to get into the Zicklin School of Business and think of my class as a stepping stone. But I would, if we have the integration of arts in all the different disciplines, the arts would be seen as like a language through which we could understand our own history, and history specific to the various disciplines. And I really like the idea of moving in through the, with water, with that experiment. I thought that was the way the arts brought those things together, and I think that could be a really great model for even within the academic realm. So
Great.
thank you.
Thank
And thanks
you.
for this. This is amazing.
Great. Fantastic. So many voices make this so rich. Anyone else up there? Great, right here. Right here? Yeah.
I have to read it, though. I'm sorry. Is it okay if I read it?
Of course.
Okay. So, my name is Jill Barganetti, and I'm a professor of biological sciences at CUNY Hunter College. And so, just to piggyback on you, and I'm part of CUNY Arts, I teach a class called Choreographing Genomics. So, I would fight for natural and physical science education to take place in creative, performing, and visual art laboratories. I would fight to have these laboratories educate through multiple modalities of trial and error through creative, kinesthetic, visual, auditory pathways. For example, this is what I think about. DNA genome information flow, DNA politics, and DNA ethics can be taught and understood in these experimental laboratories.
Fantastic. Thank you. Great. Right over here.
As I listen, my name is Craig Kaplan, as I listen to what everybody will fight for and everybody's interested in, there is a common denominator here, which is the funding that will support every one of these fights. And when one thinks about a state budget, and I look at the chancellor, and we think about the cuts that are happening that will affect every one of these programs, that fight it doesn't precede, but must go on simultaneously. And those of us who are interested in all of these other programs have to think about how one engages in that fight at the same time.
I always love a pragmatic fighter. Anyone else up here? Yes, back there.
Hi, my name is Dina Zemsky, and along with my colleague Wendy Handler, we are here tonight from a nonprofit on the Upper West Side called DeRote, which serves seniors. Thank you. And we provide just quality arts programming for our older adults from 60 to 100. And what we learn from them every single day is lifelong learning, and creative arts programming continues at every age. And I, of course, would continue to fight for that because we're all going to age.
That's for sure. Anyone else here? Another? Yes, right over there.
God, this thing. Hi, I'm Liz Tatone. I'm also an art educator in Brooklyn. And I would strongly like to fight to maintain that our art spaces in education are a safe space for making mistakes and celebrating those mistakes so that our kids can really understand their process and their journey as thinkers and doers.
Fantastic. Great. Anyone else up there? I'm going to ask, actually, we have two people at the back, Rachel Murillo and Kelly Cannon. Do you have any tweets that you would like to share from the ether out there of people participating, our other audience?
We do have one. Oh, thank you. I'm just trying to pull it up. If you give me 1 second. We had a really great tweet earlier tonight from a partner institution. I'm just trying to find. but this has been really amazing. We've been tweeting out quotes and questions from you all throughout the evening, and people are really following along. I don't know why I can't find this. It was something along the lines of what we've been hearing all night in terms of fighting for freedom and for space for people to sort of creatively express themselves and get to know themselves in that way. I don't know.
Right. Thank you. I'm going to put Francesca Rosenberg on the spot. Yes, I am, because she's always got something great to say. So.
I can't be put on the spot. I would fight for what everyone has been talking about. You know, I fight for the children. I fight for the older people. I'm an equal player here. I fight for everybody, and I thank you.
They keep talking about the 60-year curriculum, and I think in many ways, you know, from early to older adults, it's something that we need to think about. Is there anyone else who has, yes?
Thank you for putting this together. It's terrific, Wendy. I'm Greg Gillette. I'm a professor at Queens College, and I work on the Social Practice Queens, which is a program with my wonderful colleague Chloe Bass, where we try to bring artists together with social justice issues. We've been doing it for 10 years, actually, coming up in 2020. And one of the things we've realized now, and we're sort of facing, as Chancellor Matos put it, we have a very diverse community. People are often first-generation learners. But what we haven't been able to develop is a strong sense of leadership skills amongst the arts community. Mm-hmm. And if you look at who runs the art institutions, it tends to be fairly homogeneous, people like me. So we're really trying to think of new ways that we can introduce skill sets that have to do with learning how to be leaders and have the confidence to be leaders amongst this very diverse community that we teach. And I'm open to hearing anyone's ideas that they might have, or perhaps the panel here tonight. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Greg. So last call. Anybody out there? Burning desire. There, right there.
Hi, I'm Karen Rosner, Director of Visual Arts, New York City Department of Education. Hi, Bill. We all love being in museums. We know the thrill that we get, the joy that we get. I would fight for the right for every single student in New York City to feel really comfortable in museums and feel like they belong here and in every museum in this city.
Thank you, Karen. I just want to say one thing before I turn it over to Paula, who's going to end with a question for the panel. I just want to thank my amazing team, because it wasn't me who put this together. It's this amazing group of people who, I have to tell you, the thing that gives me joy every morning is coming to work to be with them, because they are so committed and so amazing. So I'm turning it over to Paula to take us home. This is our question. No, your question. What makes you optimistic?
So, based on what you've heard, Anna, what makes you optimistic about the future of art education and engagement?
Well, I'll go a step further than optimistic. I'm hopeful, and it's in large part because of all the fighters out here who've just spoken so well. I mean, entirely because of all the fight in this audience. And Wendy, I know how hard you're working, and Glenn, I know how much you're dedicated to education, and how much MoMA over time just becomes more and more what I would call a mansion of radical hospitality, and that's really where it starts. So I'm incredibly hopeful.
Well, more than hopeful, also I'm inspired, and I think is particularly when you play the role that I do as an administrator, to be able to get energy from your faculty, from your colleagues, from folks in the field, because the work that we do is transformational. It's indispensable to the quality of life and the DNA and the ethos and everything that makes New York City. And we're extremely proud of that. And we want to make sure that, sitting here and thinking about some of the comments, particularly from some of our faculty members here, and how important it is, when I was the president at Queens, I remember sort of talking about students who came and say, I came from a working class background and I never thought that I could be a writer. And I came from a working class background, I came from an immigrant, situation, refugee status, and I never thought that I could, and you can fill in the blanks. And the work that we do is precisely to give freedom in the world of Mustafa, that they can be anything they want, anything what they wanted to be when they come in, if they were clear about that, but also to go on this journey of discovery, and art is a indispensable part of that. So I'm inspired, and thank you, because in what I do, I need inspiration.
We have so many mics. I never understand as humans why we make it so hard for ourselves. Like so many people in the audience, so many of us, we think about this thing we talk about as freedom or creativity, and yet we make so many social structures that make it so difficult to manifest that. So I think what makes me feel optimistic is how many people in this room expressing this desire for creativity and the space that it gives us to reimagine the world, that there's so many people out there, so many educators, chancellors, fabulous chancellors, and I have learned so much from my life living with artists about breaking the rules, just breaking the rules and breaking those categories and those barriers that we as humans keep creating for ourselves. And once we knock them down, we don't understand why we ever created them in the first place. So I'm optimistic that there's so many people who understand that basic, simple idea that Martians didn't come down and make it difficult to be creative. We did that to ourselves, and we can undo that. So I'm optimistic.
I'm optimistic when Greg Cholette and other people like that ask the question, how do we support new leaders? Because I think behind that question is also what does leadership look like? And I think that there are a whole load of ways in which leadership can change. Not necessarily the leaders of now, but ways of thinking about what leadership means and how to lead and what that kind of conversation is. So I'm very optimistic when that conversation starts opening up.
I am optimistic because Kate Fowle is back in New York. I'm optimistic because over 100 people woke up this morning, got out of bed, washed their faces, washed their hands, took a shower maybe, got some food, spent the next 10 to 12 hours navigating life and found their way here to share this moment with one another, because we all recognize how important spaces like this is and conversations like this are. And the work that we do is essential to our survival as a species, as you were alluding to.
I just want to thank everyone, and I am so optimistic that the ethos that MoMA was founded with continues to carry on by engaging our audience, by engaging our visitors, by engaging all of these brilliant minds. And so, steady on course. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Please join us for a reception and celebration outside. Thank you.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Thank you. Thank you so much for all you do and for this club. So I'm always happy to be a part. Well, we're so happy to work with Carol. Can we take a picture?